All right, in a few weeks, we are going to begin, Lord willing, a series on the final chapters of the book of Hebrews. We'll begin halfway through chapter number 10 and go through chapter 13, which finishes the book of Hebrews. And in order to get us ready for that series, what I want to do over the next several weeks leading up to the beginning of Hebrews is provide some videos that walk us through the beginning portion of Hebrews. Hebrews is a grand book with big arguments. And so what I want to do is kind of walk through those in a series of videos that will lead up then to beginning our series in a few weeks on Hebrews 10, 11, 12, and 13. Now, usually when you begin studying a book of the Bible, you begin by asking some questions like, who wrote the book? When did they write the book? Who are they writing to? And when we get to some of Paul's epistles, it's super easy to answer those questions because Paul's name is right in the beginning, and who he wrote the book is right in the beginning. For Hebrews, we don't get that. In fact, the writer of Hebrews is so in the background of the book, we don't even know who the writer of Hebrews was. And there's some people who guess. There's some people who say Paul. Some people say Luke. There are a few other individuals tossed out. Growing up, I always sided with the Luke side of the argument, and not because I really thought the evidence was grand, but because it'd be cool if Luke wrote the book just because that's my name. I've kind of moved on to some other arguments and some educated guesses on who wrote the book. But I actually think there's reason why we don't know the author of Hebrews, based upon what Hebrews is really about. See, we don't even know who we wrote it to. We do have ability to read the book and not know why they wrote the book. Hebrews is a grand theological book. Big argument, like I said. And some of that grand argument about the theme leads individuals to simply say, look at this book. For 9 chapters, it's just showing this big argument that Jesus is greater. Which is actually why I think some of the reason we don't get the author at the beginning, because the focus is upon Jesus. Now, Jesus is greater is massively important in the book, but I think that's an incomplete theme or why we have the book of Hebrews. The full argument of the book of Hebrews goes a little bit deeper than that, because also throughout the book of Hebrews, there are these repeated calls of don't fall away. In fact, we see it a couple different times in chapters 2 and later on in the book. It's called don't turn back, don't fall away. Now that's the negative command, don't fall away. If you get to Hebrews 12, you get to the positive command, endure, persevere, press on, keep on believing, hold on to faith, don't give up. Now, that I think we can connect with. I mean, maybe the temptation is not to completely just turn away from the faith, although it might be where you're at. But needing a call to endure in the midst of suffering, needing a call to persevere, to press on, needing a call to hold on to your faith. Now that's a needed call. And so whatever persecutions they were going through, we don't know. Whatever pressures they were feeling, we don't know. Whatever problems, whatever pulls for them to turn back away from Christ, they needed a call. They needed an encouragement. Simply saying, here's the book of Hebrews, endure in your faith because Christ is better than anything else. And that argument begins right from the very beginning. The book of Hebrews opens up, and within the first 3 verses, we have, in a way, I would say, we have this glorious resume of Jesus Christ. If I had to write my complete resume, my first job was a paper route on Tuesday nights, and then I moved on to concession stands, and then I finally was age-worthy enough to actually have a legit job, and then I worked at Chick-fil-A, and then I've had like a dozen other jobs after that to the job I have right now. So I don't care what your resume is. Jesus' resume blows our resumes out of the water. So, I mean, here's his resume from just the first 3 verses of the book of Hebrews. He is the heir of all things. Under accomplishments, he made the universe. And then under accomplishments, he made purification for sins, and then he holds the universe together by the power of his word. Who is Jesus under this resume? Well, he's the individual who shares God's divine nature, his glory. And he's described as greater than all the angels. a resume like that within the first 3 verses, you don't even need to call the references. Now, the chapter concludes, chapter 1, because he's made this statement in verse number 4 that Jesus' name is above, more superior than all the angels. It concludes then with 7 quotes from the Old Testament to prove that Jesus is greater than all the angels. Now, you might not have ever had to wrestle with whether Jesus was greater than angels. So where he starts with this book, whether you probably can at least connect with some of the great truths of the Trinity and atonement for sins and creation and preservation of creation within the first 3 verses, Jesus greater than the angels is not something I think many of you stay awake at night wondering about. But if you think back to an audience of a Jewish background that, looking back to the Old Testament, did not have a view of Messiah having to be deity, God himself, that then also had a very high view of God's angels, messengers, it would be an easy bridge to get to where they would begin to view Jesus as a messenger from God. And wow, God has a lot of wonderful messengers. Look at all the angels in the Old Testament that we see, and even declaring Jesus' birth. That it'd be easy to begin to view Jesus on a plane with all the other messengers from God. And Hebrews begins by saying, wait a minute now. No. Yes, Jesus is a messenger from God, but he is God. He is greater than every other messenger. He is greater than the angels. And that's where the book begins. And so he begins by, Jesus is a messenger. Long ago, at many times, and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. And I would also say God spoke through angels. But in these last times, he's spoken to us by his Son. You realize how special it is where we are at within God's revelation, that we're not Abraham getting bits and pieces of a promise, that we're not Moses getting here's some laws, we're not David, we're not hearing prophets like Samuel or sitting down hearing even John the Baptist. You realize how massively blessed we are to be able to hear revelation from God through God's Son himself, Jesus Christ. That we get the whole message of the gospel. We get to see the whole mystery unpacked. We get God's own Son. Then my mind goes to Romans 8. It tells me if God gave up his only Son, if God freely gave us his Son, will he not then also freely give us all things? I mean, if I'm going to get to Hebrews 1 and just begin with it, he's revealed himself, and then he's given himself by his Son, who is glorious, God himself, divine nature, who has made purifications for sin, and now is sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, which means he is my mediator. Then could I ever question God's goodness to me if that is what God has given to me? So, that's the first chapter. And we got more to go, a lot more to go. Big picture, though, endure. Don't give up. Persevere. Endure in your faith in Jesus, because Jesus is greater than anything else.